Welcome to Deep Fear, Dark Tales, where dark and terrifying stories come to life. Today, we bring you a suffocating horror tale set in the vast, empty lands of Texas, where a nightmare unfolds, one that none of its characters could have ever foreseen. 5 friends set off on what seems like an ordinary road trip, but what starts as a simple adventure down deserted highways soon turns into a desperate fight for survival. They're about to discover that some roads should never be traveled, and that certain encounters mark the beginning of something far more sinister. Get ready to lose yourself in a story of isolation, fear, and constant danger, where every decision might be their last. Are you ready to dive into this dark journey with Sally and her friends? Then buckle up and keep your eyes wide open, because this story will make you question whom to trust and where the real terror hides. Let's begin our story on a scorching afternoon with the Texas sun beating down on 5 friends as they drive down a lonely road. Little do they know, this trip will take them to places they never wished to see. The afternoon was blistering in the heart of Texas, and the intense heat made the asphalt look like it was melting under the van's tires. Inside the vehicle, 5 friends sat in silence, windows rolled down, trying in vain to escape the suffocating heat. The engine rumbled loudly, while the landscape around them became more desolate, dry, lifeless. Sally sat in the back seat, staring out the window. Her brother Franklin, in his makeshift wheelchair in the middle of the van, seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the heat. He groaned from time to time, complaining about the harsh environment. "Why can't we stop for a while?" Franklin said, adjusting his chair and wiping the sweat from his forehead. "This heat is unbearable." Sally sighed, not taking her eyes off the dusty road. "We're in the middle of nowhere, Franklin. There's nowhere to stop." Pam, sitting next to Sally, glanced towards the driver, Jerry, who gripped the wheel with determination. "Are we far from the house?" she asked, trying to ease the growing tension among them. Jerry threw a quick glance in the rearview mirror before responding. "Still a few hours. We're almost out of gas, though, so we need to find a station soon." Kirk, sitting next to Jerry, tried to stay optimistic. "We'll find some place around here. Some small, lost town in the middle of Texas." Despite his words, the landscape around them showed no signs of life. Just barren fields, broken fences, and dead trees. It seemed like they had left any trace of civilization behind hours ago. Silence returned to the van as the stifling heat and exhaustion made the journey feel even longer. Suddenly, something broke the monotony. Up ahead, a figure appeared on the road, walking unsteadily. It was a thin man, dressed in worn-out clothes, with a small backpack slung over his shoulder. He was waving for a ride. "I don't think it's a good idea to stop," Sally said, her voice showing a hint of unease. "He looks like he needs help," Kirk replied, shifting in his seat. "We can drop him off a little further down the road." Jerry slowed the van, pulling over next to the man. He had a ragged appearance, his face dirty, and an awkward smile. The man climbed in with a nod of thanks. "Thanks for the ride," the stranger said, his voice a little rough. "Are you folks headed far?" "We're on our way to an old family house belonging to Sally and Franklin," Jerry explained. "What about you? Need to go somewhere specific?" The man gave a faint smile, but something in his expression made the group uneasy. "Just passing through. I like walking these roads, but things aren't always easy around here, you know." Sally felt a chill at the man's cryptic tone. He kept talking, but his words seemed disjointed, mixing stories about life in the countryside, hard labor, and other things that didn't make much sense. The atmosphere inside the van, once just stifling from the heat, now felt heavy in a different way. "I've been to many places," the stranger continued, speaking more to himself than the others. But these roads can be treacherous. With each word, Sally's discomfort grew. She exchanged a look with Pam, who seemed equally unsettled by the man's presence. "Maybe you should get off at the next gas station," Jerry suggested, trying to sound casual, but clearly wanting to end the situation. The man looked at Jerry for a moment before nodding slightly. "Sure, no problem. The next place will be fine for me." After a few minutes of tense silence, the van approached a run-down gas station. The rusty pumps and the almost abandoned look of the place were far from inviting, but it was the only sign of life they'd seen for hours. Jerry pulled over, and the stranger got out, thanking them again before walking off toward the station. The group watched in silence as he disappeared into the distance. "That guy was weird," Pam finally said, breaking the heavy silence that had gripped the van. "I knew this wasn't going to end well," Sally muttered, still staring at the spot where the man had vanished. Something about that encounter had left her on edge, though she couldn't explain exactly why. "Let's just fill up and get out of here," Jerry suggested, and everyone silently agreed. The stranger had left them all with a new sense of urgency. The heat was still intense, but now the mood inside the van was pure tension. Jerry approached the gas pump and noticed something odd. The old station seemed deserted, with no one in sight. He got out to check and looked around, frustrated. "No gas here. What are we going to do?" The van kept idling softly, as if it knew they hadn't escaped the strangeness of the day just yet. The tension still hung in the air as the van rolled down the road, the unsettling encounter with the hitchhiker lingering in everyone's minds. Silence weighed heavily, broken only by the monotonous hum of the engine. The gas tank was nearly empty, and Jerry focused on finding any sign of civilization. Finally, in the distance, a small structure appeared by the roadside. An old gas station with a rusted fuel pump and a weathered sign stood ahead. The relief was immediate. "Finally, some luck," Kirk remarked, breaking the silence as Jerry maneuvered the van toward the pump. They stopped in front of the station, but quickly realized something was off. There were no other cars around, and the only visible person was an elderly man sitting in a rocking chair on the porch of the station, his expression uninterested. He slowly got up when he saw the van approaching, walking with slow, dragging steps. "Excuse me, sir," Jerry said, stepping out of the car. "We need gas. Can you help us out?" The old man looked at the group as small, tired eyes narrowing as he shook his head. "No gas," he replied in a raspy voice. "The truck hasn't come yet. Maybe tomorrow." Jerry glanced at the near-empty tank and frowned. "We don't have much time. Is there any other option?" The old man shrugged, scratching his head. "You can wait a while, rest up. There's a place to eat further up if you want. But gas, I don't have." Sally and Pam stepped out of the van, visibly exhausted. The heat was unbearable, and Franklin, stuck in the stifling interior, was restless. They exchanged uncertain looks, unsure of what to do next. "Waiting here doesn't seem like a good idea," Sally said, glancing around. "Maybe we can look around and find help. We might be able to find gas further ahead." "Is there an abandoned house around here?" Franklin asked, his voice laced with discomfort. He was still shaken from the earlier encounter and the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The old man gave a barely perceptible smile, as if he knew something they didn't. "There's a few houses around, but nothing that'll help you," he said vaguely. "If I were you, I'd stay close." The way he spoke sent a chill down Sally's spine, despite the blistering heat. Something was wrong here. Jerry, however, ignored the unsettling feeling. "Let's keep moving and see what we can find," he decided, climbing back into the van. "We can't waste time." The group got back into the car, but the tension remained. The old man watched them as they drove off, his eerie gaze following the van until it was out of sight. Inside the vehicle, the silence returned, but now there was something else, a sense that they were being watched. Even with no gas, continuing down the road seemed like the only option. "Hope we don't have to come back here," Pam murmured almost to herself. Sally didn't respond, but she couldn't shake the feeling of deep unease. Something about the old man's veiled warning carried more weight than any of them wanted to admit. The heat, the silence, and the discomfort all seemed to conspire against them, making the journey increasingly oppressive. The van dragged along the dirt path, kicking up a cloud of dust that seemed to choke the horizon. As they moved forward, the landscape grew even more desolate. Dead trees, rusted fences, and dry fields seemed to trap the group in a place with no way out. Conversation had dwindled, and everyone was lost in their own unsettling thoughts. The suffocating heat didn't help. "Is this road ever going to end?" Franklin grumbled, wiping the sweat from his brow. He was visibly uncomfortable, his breathing heavy and shallow. Sally glanced at him, concerned. "We need to stop soon, Franklin. We'll find somewhere." And then, as if fate had answered her plea, an old, imposing house appeared in the distance. The structure, once grand, was now worn and crumbling. The windows were broken, and the once white paint was peeling, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Surrounding the house was a rusty wire fence, partially collapsed. "Look over there," Kirk said, pointing toward the house. "I think we found a place. Let's check it out. Maybe someone can help us." "You think anyone lives there?" Pam asked, incredulous. "That looks more like a horror movie set." "Or a Western," Kirk replied with a smirk. "Let's just see if we find anything. Maybe they have gas, or at least some water." Jerry parked the van under the shade of a few dead trees, about 50 meters from the house. The engine sputtered and died with a final, rattling gasp. Sally gazed at the house with a growing sense of unease. Everything about this place felt wrong, but they didn't have many options. "I don't think we should go in," Sally said hesitantly. "This doesn't feel safe." "I'll be quick," Kirk replied, already stepping out of the car. "Pam, you coming with me?" Pam looked around, feeling uncertain, but she eventually followed Kirk toward the house. The air was thick, and the silence was unsettling, broken only by the sound of their footsteps crunching over the dry earth. "If it's quick, maybe it won't be so bad," Pam murmured to herself, more than to Kirk. As they approached the house, the front door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Kirk stepped forward and pushed the door open with a loud creak that echoed through the empty house. Inside, the air was even heavier, filled with a strange metallic smell. The walls were filthy, covered in dark stains that looked like they were from some old liquid. Pam stepped back. "Kirk, I don't think this is a good idea." Kirk, however, continued to explore, determined to find something useful. "Relax, I'll just take a quick look." He ventured further into the house, calling out for anyone, but received no reply. The silence was oppressive. Pam stood frozen at the doorway, glancing around nervously. Her heart beat faster with every passing second. What had seemed like an innocent exploration was starting to feel like a trap. Suddenly, there was a loud noise from inside. Something moved. Pam held her breath, frozen. "Kirk!" she called, her voice trembling. No response. She hesitated for a moment longer, but her survival instinct kicked in. "Kirk, I'm heading back to the car. We need to leave." She began to back away quickly, but before she could get far, a terrifying sound echoed through the house, a loud, desperate scream from Kirk, followed by a grotesque thud, like something heavy crashing to the floor. Pam turned toward the door, panic rising. Before she could make a move, something emerged from the shadows. A massive man, wearing a grotesque mask made of human skin, holding a chainsaw, stepped into view. Leatherface. Pam screamed and stumbled backward, but there was no time to escape. Pam stumbled backward in panic as the deafening roar of the chainsaw echoed through the house. The masked man, colossal and monstrous in his presence, advanced with heavy steps, his weapon of destruction already revving, growling like a wild beast. For a second, she was frozen, her wide eyes locked on the grotesque mask made of human skin. Pam's scream tore through the silence of the house. She spun around and bolted toward the front door, her heart pounding, her lungs burning with desperation. Every second felt like an eternity as she fought to escape this absolute nightmare. Her feet thudded against the worn wooden floor, the sound of her footsteps drowned by the continuous roar of the chainsaw. She reached the front door, shoving it open, but panic caused her to trip on the threshold. She crashed to the ground with a dull thud, the impact knocking the wind out of her. As she scrambled desperately to get up, the sound of the chainsaw drew closer. He was right behind her. With trembling hands, she pushed herself up and ran outside, her eyes locked on the van where the others were waiting. Franklin, Sally, and Jerry had no idea of the horror that was about to descend upon them. Pam ran as fast as she could, not daring to look back, the sound of the chainsaw growing dangerously close. Sweat poured down her face, mingling with tears she barely realized were falling. Her mind was in chaos, consumed by one word: escape. Meanwhile, inside the van, Sally, Franklin, and Jerry were discussing Kirk and Pam's disappearance. The group's unease was growing. "This is taking too long," Sally said nervously. "Something's wrong. We should have gone with them." "Maybe they're just taking time to find something," Jerry suggested, though doubt was clear in his voice. "It doesn't make sense," Franklin interjected. "Why haven't they come back? What if something happened?" At that moment, Pam appeared in the distance, running frantically toward the van. Her breath was ragged, and her eyes were filled with an indescribable terror. Sally was the first to see her and jumped out of the van. "Pam!" Sally shouted, running toward her. "What happened? Where's Kirk?" Pam couldn't respond. Her mouth moved, but no words came out. She kept running, trying to reach the van, pointing frantically back toward the house. But before she could say anything, the sound of the chainsaw cut through the air. Leatherface came charging out of the house, his chainsaw roaring as he sprinted toward the two women. Jerry and Franklin froze for a moment, the shock gripping their bodies. The scene unfolding before them felt unreal, as if they had been thrown into a nightmare. "We need to get out of here now," Jerry shouted, jumping into the driver's seat and turning the key. The van roared to life, but Pam and Sally were still outside. Pam tripped again, collapsing to the ground, exhausted and terrified. Sally ran back to help her up, but Leatherface was already too close. He raised the chainsaw, ready to strike. Desperate, Sally yanked Pam with all her strength, practically throwing her to the ground, pulling her out of the reach of the monstrous man. The chainsaw buzzed through the air, cutting into the space where Pam had been just seconds before. The noise was deafening, and the smell of gasoline and burnt metal filled the air. Franklin screamed from inside the van, completely helpless, while Jerry frantically tried to rev the engine. Leatherface took another step toward the two women, his movements clumsy but quick. Pam was nearly unconscious from terror and exhaustion, and Sally knew they didn't have much time. With a final burst of adrenaline, Sally managed to drag Pam further away from the killer. Leatherface roared in frustration, his chainsaw buzzing in his hands as he prepared for another attack. The brutality of the scene was overwhelming. the fear suffocating. Pam's fate seemed all but sealed. However, with one last desperate effort, Pam broke free from Sally's grasp, shoving her away and stumbling toward the woods. Enraged, Leatherface shifted his focus to Pam and chased after her, leaving Sally behind. Sally, panting, managed to get up and sprint toward the van. She reached the vehicle and threw herself inside, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She glanced back one last time, seeing Leatherface vanish into the trees, his chainsaw still roaring as he pursued Pam. Jerry finally managed to get the engine going. The van lurched forward violently, leaving behind the distant sound of the chainsaw and the horrifying certainty that something unspeakable had happened in that house. The van jolted violently along the uneven road, but inside, the silence was as heavy as the suffocating heat. Sally sat in the back seat, gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. Her eyes were glazed, still filled with terror, and her fingers trembled on her knees. Franklin, in the front seat, was equally shocked, unable to find the words to describe the scene they had witnessed. "This isn't real, it can't be real," Franklin muttered, his voice fragile, barely audible. He stared blankly at the desolate horizon, not truly seeing what lay ahead. "Where are Kirk and Pam?" Sally finally managed to respond, her mind still a storm of confusion. I don't know," her voice came out in a raspy whisper. Pam, he got her." Jerry, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, broke the silence. "We have to go back and find Kirk. We can't just leave them there." He couldn't accept the idea of abandoning his friends, but the terror on Sally's face made it clear that going back meant facing something unimaginable. "You saw what happened to her. That thing wasn't human," Sally shouted, her voice breaking between sobs. "We can't go back. We can't just leave." Jerry shot back, his voice rising. He was torn between the logic of fleeing to save their lives and the crushing guilt of abandoning Kirk and Pam. Sally shook her head, her eyes wild with desperation. "I don't know what that was, but it wasn't normal, and we can't fight it." Franklin looked at Jerry, his expression a mix of fear and helplessness. "She's right. We need help. Maybe there's someone on the road, or we can go back to the gas station and call the police." Jerry hesitated. The idea of returning to the safety of the gas station seemed like an option. But what about Kirk? The thought of his friend wandering through that cursed house, unaware of the deadly threat lurking there, was enough to consume him with guilt. After a brief moment of tense silence, Jerry exhaled heavily and reluctantly turned the van back toward the house. "I'll go back, alone. I can't leave Kirk there. If I'm not back in half an hour, you drive away." "No," Sally cried out, grabbing Jerry's arm. "Don't go alone. We can't split up again. That's how this all started." "I'll be quick," Jerry replied, his voice resolute as he opened the van door. "Stay here." Without waiting for a response, he stepped out of the van and began walking toward the abandoned house. Each step felt heavy, as if something unseen was pulling him back, but he pressed on. Franklin and Sally remained in the van, watching in silence, the tension between them almost tangible. The heat seemed to grow even more unbearable as Jerry walked. The sky was beginning to darken, tinged with an oppressive red. As he neared the house, he called out for Kirk, but only the echo of his own voice answered. "This is madness," he muttered to himself, but he kept going. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere became thick, oppressive, and the air felt dense, almost unbreathable. The stench of something rotting filled the space, Cautiously, Jerry explored the first room, calling for Kirk again. The silence was total, save for a faint creaking sound coming from somewhere in the distance. A chill ran down his spine. "Come on, Kirk, where are you?" His voice was a whisper, more to himself than to anyone listening. Then, out of nowhere, a heavy noise echoed through the house. Something or someone was there. Before he could react, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. Night had fallen completely by the time Sally and Franklin realized something was terribly wrong. Their friends had been gone far too long, and the sense that something dark was surrounding them only intensified. The stars barely flickered in the cloudy sky, and the darkness around them was almost absolute. The only light came from a small flashlight that Franklin clumsily held in his trembling hands. "I don't know what happened to them," Franklin muttered, restless. "We should have gone with them." Sally was nervous. Every sound around them seemed amplified by the forest's darkness, and her mind raced with increasingly desperate thoughts. "We have to find them," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Maybe they're lost." Franklin hesitated, but knew there was no other option. "I'll go with you. Just help me get out of the van." Sally nodded and helped her brother out of the vehicle. The two made their way down the path toward the abandoned house they had seen from a distance, hoping to find some sign of their friends. Franklin was visibly uncomfortable, his fear growing with each step, while Sally kept her focus ahead, trying to push away the rising panic. They walked along the narrow, dusty road, the sounds of the night becoming increasingly oppressive. Crickets chirped, the wind whispered through the dry trees, and something else distant sounded like a low buzzing, but Sally couldn't quite place it. She ignored it, believing her mind was playing tricks due to the nervousness. "It's too quiet," Franklin murmured. "Way too quiet." Sally didn't respond, but the thought echoed in her mind. They walked a bit further until the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the stillness. Sally and Franklin stopped suddenly, both hearts racing. They stood in silence, holding their breath, trying to pinpoint the sound. Then, out of nowhere, something emerged from the darkness, a figure running desperately toward them. Sally barely had time to process what she was seeing as the figure came closer. "Pam!" she shouted, incredulous. Pam appeared out of the darkness, her face twisted with terror, her hair disheveled, and her clothes torn. She stumbled and fell, but immediately got back up, desperate to keep moving. Her fear was so palpable that Sally felt an instant chill run down her spine. "Run!" Pam screamed, nearly out of breath. "He's coming!" Before Sally could ask who was coming, the distant sound she had ignored earlier, the low buzzing, grew louder. Now it was clear and terrifying, the metallic whine of a chainsaw revving and approaching fast. Sally froze in fear, unable to comprehend what was happening. But Franklin, vulnerable and immobile, panicked. "What's happening?" he shouted, trying to move but trapped in his wheelchair. "We have to go." Sally finally snapped out of it, pulling Franklin with all her strength, trying to make him move faster. The chainsaw's roar was getting louder, closer, and she knew time was running out. Pam, still dazed and exhausted from her desperate escape, continued running, but the fear in her eyes told Sally that the danger was nearly upon them. And then he appeared. From the shadows of the forest, a gigantic figure, with a hideous mask covering his face, emerged, holding a chainsaw that roared with a deafening sound. Leatherface, his presence was monstrous, a vision straight from a nightmare. He advanced with heavy, relentless steps in pursuit. "Franklin, let's go!" Sally screamed, pulling her brother with all her might. But the wheelchair kept getting caught on roots and rocks in the dirt path, making it impossible to move quickly. Pam was already far ahead, running through the darkness without looking back, but Sally knew they wouldn't escape in time. Fear consumed her body, quickening her movements, but the weight of the wheelchair made escape impossible. No. Franklin screamed, terrified and helpless. Sally tried one last time to pull her brother, but before she could react, the deafening sound of the chainsaw drew closer. Leatherface was upon them. In a split second, Sally saw the metallic glint of the blade illuminated by the moonlight. She let out a scream, but it was drowned out by the brutal noise of the saw. Without thinking, Sally let go of Franklin and began to run. She could barely breathe, each step an almost impossible effort. Her bare feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted toward the forest. She could hear the sound of the chainsaw still close, but she didn't dare look back. Fear completely consumed her as she tore through the dense forest. Branches whipped her face and arms, cutting her skin, but the pain was overshadowed by the terror. She dodged trees and bushes, trying to get as far away from the danger as possible. The sound of the chainsaw ebbed and flowed, like a constant, looming shadow. Sally ran aimlessly, driven only by the desperate need to survive. The rough terrain and darkness made every step dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Every time the sound of the saw faded, she thought she might have escaped. But then, like a cruel reminder, it would return, closer, louder. She didn't know how long she had been running, but finally, when she felt her body could take no more, the sound of the chainsaw stopped. The silence was absolute, almost deafening after the chaos. Sally stopped, gasping for breath, her eyes wide as she looked around, trying to understand if she was finally safe. Her mind was blank. The terror had stripped everything away. She was alone, lost in the forest, with only the sounds of the night for company. The immediate danger seemed to have disappeared, but the fear was still rooted deep inside her, unyielding and relentless. Sally slowly regained consciousness, her head spinning as she tried to understand where she was. The dim light in the room felt blinding after the darkness of the night, and the heat inside the house was suffocating. She blinked several times, trying to focus her vision. The strange, metallic smell in the air only heightened her confusion. As she tried to move, Sally realized her hands were tied to the arms of a wooden chair. Panic immediately rose in her throat, and she began to struggle against the ropes, but the knots were too tight. Her breathing quickened, and she looked around, trying to grasp what was happening. The room she found herself in was small and old, with rustic, worn furniture scattered around. The central table was set for what looked like a dinner, but what truly caught her attention was the presence of the people in the room. Sitting at the head of the table was an elderly, thin figure, nearly motionless, with glazed eyes and a vacant expression. Across from him, two men were watching Sally with strange smiles. One of them was the same massive, masked man who had chased her earlier with the chainsaw. Next to him was another man, medium in stature and disheveled in appearance, who seemed to be the leader of the group. Both watched her with expressions of amusement, as if they were about to begin some kind of twisted ritual. Well, the guest has finally woken up," the disheveled man said, smiling at Sally. His tone was light, but it carried a disturbing malice. Sally tried to speak, but her voice came out as a shaky whisper. What do you want from me?" The man laughed. "Oh, darling, you're our special guest for dinner. We don't get visitors every day." She looked around again, her heart pounding faster, trying to think of a way to escape. Everything seemed out of place, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The sense of dread grew with every passing second. The others in the room continued to watch her, as if savoring the fear that emanated from her. The large man in the mask, whom Sally now recognized as her pursuer from the previous night, remained silent, but his eyes, or at least what she could see through the mask, seemed to glimmer in an unsettling way. Come on, the leader said excitedly. We can't keep our guest waiting. Grandpa's already here, ready to join in. Sally glanced at the elderly man at the head of the table. He appeared frail and exhausted, almost lifeless. But the way the leader spoke about him made her realize he was a central figure in this bizarre place. Even in his almost immobile state, he seemed to be revered by the others, as though he were the patriarch of this twisted family. Let's show our guest what Grandpa can do, the disheveled man continued, carefully lifting the old man and bringing him closer to Sally. The old man's gaze was vacant, but the respect with which the others treated him only deepened Sally's discomfort. As they adjusted the old man to participate in this disturbing dinner, Sally seized the moment of distraction to try to free herself. Her wrists ached from the effort of loosening the ropes, but she knew she had to find a way to escape. The tension in the room grew worse as the preparations for the dinner continued. The masked man went to a corner and switched on an old hanging lamp, casting more light over the bizarre scene. The leader's smile widened as he pulled up a chair to sit at the table. Now we're ready, he exclaimed, as if about to begin a celebratory meal. Sally continued struggling in silence, trying to conceal her movements from her captors. The rope around her left wrist finally began to give way, and her heart leaped with hope. Hey, the masked man, who had been silent until now, suddenly turned as if sensing something was wrong. He watched Sally with piercing eyes, and for a moment, she thought he had noticed her escape attempt. But instead, he moved toward the table, ignoring her for the moment, and gestured to the leader. Everything's ready, he said, his voice low and almost unintelligible. Great, the leader exclaimed. Now we can start the real dinner. Sally knew she had no time left. With a sharp movement, she freed her left wrist completely. Taking advantage of their distraction, she quickly pulled her right wrist free from the chair. Without hesitation, Sally stood up and bolted toward the door, the sound of her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The leader's shout of "Get her!" filled the air, but she didn't stop. Her entire body was driven by survival instinct. She ran as fast as she could through the house, not knowing where she was going, but certain that she had to get out before it was too late. Sally ran through the darkness, her bare feet stumbling over the uneven, rocky ground. The deafening roar of the chainsaw filled the air behind her, mixed with the hysterical screams and twisted laughter of Nubbins, who chased her with disturbing giggles and incoherent words. Fear was the only thing fueling her now. Her legs were trembling with exhaustion, her lungs burned, and her arms still ached from the ropes she had desperately torn away from. The front door was in sight, wide open like an escape from hell, but with every step, Leatherface seemed closer. The sound of the chainsaw was brutal, so loud it reverberated in Sally's chest, amplifying her sense of absolute terror. She didn't dare look back. She just ran. When she reached the door, her body practically hurled itself outside. The night air, though warm, hit her like a gust of hope. But she knew she wasn't safe yet. Leatherface was right behind her. The monster with the grotesque mask wouldn't give up that easily. She bolted toward the dirt path leading to the main road. The branches of trees and dry bushes scratched her as she tried to dodge them. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror that consumed her. Nubbin's shouts and laughter echoed closer and closer as he clumsily charged through the darkness, taunting her desperate attempt to escape. "You're not getting away, girl!" he shouted, as if it were a twisted game. Grandpa still wants dinner. Sally couldn't think. Her mind was in full panic mode, driven purely by instinct. Running along the road, her desperate eyes searched for any sign of life, any light that could mean salvation. She knew she was far from any town or house, but maybe, just maybe, someone might be driving down that desolate road. And then, as if in answer to her silent plea, headlights appeared in the distance. Her eyes widened in relief. A truck was coming, heavy and slow, but it was the only hope she had. With the last of her strength, she threw herself into the middle of the road, waving her arms frantically. "Help! Please!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate, echoing into the vast emptiness. The truck screeched to a halt, the tires squealing against the asphalt. The driver, visibly confused, jumped out of the cab to see what was happening. He barely had time to process the scene before Sally collapsed into his arms, her body trembling and covered in blood, unable to form coherent words. "Help, they there after me," she whispered, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Behind them, the roar of the chainsaw grew louder. The driver, a burly man with a bewildered expression, looked down the road from where Sally had come. The imposing silhouette of Leatherface emerged from the darkness, the chainsaw growling furiously in his hands. Without hesitation, the driver shouted for Sally to climb into the cab. "Get in, quick!" Sally barely managed to drag herself into the truck's cab, panic clouding her vision as she struggled to stay conscious. The driver rushed back to his seat, firing up the engine as fast as he could, but Leatherface was nearly upon them. When the truck finally roared to life, the sound of the chainsaw was drowned out by the engine. The truck sped off, leaving the chaos behind. Sally glanced out the back window, gasping for air and still in shock, as she watched Leatherface standing in the middle of the road, swinging his chainsaw through the air in a furious frenzy, like a defeated animal. The chainsaw roared impotently as he spun around, flailing the weapon wildly, frustrated by his lost prey. The scene was pure madness, a monster trapped in his own despair, unable to cope with his victim's escape. Sally, now far away, collapsed into the seat, laughing and crying at the same time. Her emotions were in turmoil, and her body, drained, couldn't distinguish between relief and trauma. The truck rumbled through the darkness, carrying her away from that nightmare. But the horror of that night would stay with her forever. Sally sat in the truck's seat, her eyes staring blankly into the void as the vehicle rumbled down the dark road. The hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the truck were the only sounds she could hear. The initial relief of having escaped began to blend with the exhaustion and shock of everything she had just experienced. Her body still trembled slightly, her sweaty hands gripping her knees as she tried to process it all. The driver, though confused and worried about Sally's condition, chose not to ask questions. He drove in silence, occasionally glancing at her, but letting her be with her own thoughts. The night outside was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos and terror she had faced moments before. Sally closed her eyes, but even then, the images from the horrific night didn't fade. The sound of the wind mixed in her mind with the echoes of voices, the chases, and the constant feeling that something was still lurking, ready to catch up with her. Her breathing was still uneven, her body in a state of alert, as if she wasn't completely safe yet. "It's okay now. You're safe," the driver finally said, trying to comfort her, though unsure of what exactly had happened. Sally tried to respond, but her voice came out shaky and weak. I don't know if this will ever end." She took a deep breath, as if trying to convince herself that she had truly escaped. In the distance, the faint lights of a town began to appear on the horizon. The soft, distant glow seemed to offer a promise of safety, a return to normalcy, something she hadn't felt since everything began. Yet, deep down, Sally knew that normalcy was far behind her, buried along with the events of the previous night. The truck slowed as it approached the town's entrance. The driver pulled into a well-lit area, where a few people still wandered the streets, unaware of the terror Sally had endured. He stepped out of the truck to find help, leaving Sally alone on the seat for a moment. She looked around, her breathing steadier now, but the fear still clung to her mind. Even though the nightmare had ended, something inside her had changed forever. The city lights seemed safe, but the world around her would never be the same again. With tears still in her eyes, Sally realized that she was alive, but she also understood that what she had lived through would stay with her forever. She had survived, but the weight of that night, the faces that haunted her, the desperate runs for her life, the profound despair, would become a permanent part of her. When help finally arrived, Sally didn't say a word. She just let herself be taken away, feeling the relief of being far from the horror, but knowing the true challenge would be coping with all she had endured.
If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Your support is really important to us and motivates us to bring more amazing stories. Thank you for watching.